Today we're going to talk about lighting and cameras, specifically creating different types of lights, modifying those lights, as well as creating cameras and modifying those settings as well. First, let's go to our Create tab and create a light. So we'll go to our Create tab and we'll go to Lighting, click on the lights. By default, 3ds Max has photometric in our drop-down. Instead, we're going to click our drop-down and choose Standard. I'm going to click on an Omni light. It's one of my favorite ones. And then I'm going to put it somewhere in my scene. And what we'll see when I do that is that a lot of our scene has gone dark. That's because the light that we have put in this scene is overriding 3ds Max default lights. So we'll move that to wherever we want it to be. Over here is fine. And this one is blue because I was playing around with the lights earlier, making sure that I was able to cover everything I wanted to. Now that we have it created, we're going to go to our Modify tab. Once we create something and we want to modify it or change it, we do so through the Modify tab. So by default, 3ds Max has our color of the light is white, our multiplier is 1. This is default. We can come in and change any one of these attributes that we want to. What we can see at the top is we have our light on, and if we click it off, we'll see that our scene goes dark. Click it back on and our light is again lighting our scene. And we have the type of light that we have. So Omni, again, we can choose spotlight, directional light, and it will turn our Omni light into those type of lights. But we're going to stick with Omni for this one. And then we have shadows. By default, shadows are not on. So let's go ahead and click on. And now we can see in our scene that we're casting shadows. We can also use global settings or change our shadow type, but for what we're going to do, shadow map is perfectly fine. As you saw earlier, the multiplier and the color, or our color swatch here, will affect our light as well. The higher our multiplier number, the brighter our light will be. The lower that number, the softer or the darker our light will be. And then the color, we can change it to whatever color we want, and it will cast that color light, as we've seen. Underneath intensity, color, and attenuation, we have near attenuation and far attenuation. Near attenuation is where our light is going to start. Far attenuation is where we want our light to stop. Anything past this and our light will not show. Let's look at that. Let's look at far attenuation. So first we're going to show our spheres. These are the spheres of influence, meaning this inner sphere is where our light will start to degrade, and this outer sphere is where we will no longer show the light. Past this sphere and we won't show light. So if we click Use and bring our far end closer, we can see that past that sphere, we don't show any light. Let's change our multiplier so we have a little bit better idea of what we're talking about here. And we can see that where our sphere hits our floor and our wall, we have light. But past that, this other wall that's outside of our sphere, we don't see any light at all. We can change that number to be whatever you want. Or if you don't want to use it, you don't have to use it at all. So let's change that back to a softer color. The next thing I want to look at is Advanced Effects. Underneath the Intensity, Color, Attenuation tab, Advanced Effects, specifically what I want to take a look at is our projector map. I can do this with an Omni light, but it's a little bit easier to see with a different light. So I'm going to go back to my Create tab, choose a Target Spotlight, and then I'm going to bring it into my scene. I'll click and drag. So I click for my camera and drag for my target. A target light will always use, or will rather always look at a target. I guess it will use it too. So I can move that target wherever I want, and we see that the camera is looking at the target as well. And target, it's a light. If I move my light, it will still look at the target. So maybe that's where I want my target light to be. And we can see on the ground, the target light is casting a light. Within that light, we have softer shadows from our Omni light. Here we can again go into our Modify tab. We can choose shadows if we want our shadows to be on. We will see that the light type is a spot and it is targeted. If we uncheck that, our target will go away, but we'll keep it there for right now. Then let's go look at our advanced effects projector map. What a projector map will do is it will allow us to project an image or material through our light. Let's see how that works. Projector map, we'll turn on map. And then here for none, when we click on none, we'll have our material and map browser. If we have a material in our scene that we want to use, we can come under scene materials, or a material slot that we want to use, we can do that. We can also do the standard materials that come with 3ds Max. I'm going to choose a bitmap and then just choose one of these from the scene assets that come with 3ds Max. You may not be able to see it right now, but if we render, and I'm going to go to my render setup, which is F10 on our keyboard, or we can choose here at the top, render setup, and there are other ways to do it, but these are quick ways for me. So I'm just going to hit F10 and I'll bring my render setup and render. And what we see, let me zoom in a little bit. We'll render this a little again so you can see it a little bit better. If I render, we can see that our spotlight, our targeted spotlight, is showing that material through our light. So that can be really helpful if we want to, I don't know, flash a shadow on the screen or something, or on a wall if somebody's walking around it. Whatever it is that you can think to do with it, you can do with it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, since we've looked at that, I'm going to go ahead and turn off projector map, and I'm going to move my target over the car, maybe move my light itself over the car, so we have more of a spotlight on top of the car. And then what I would like to go over is atmospheres and effects. Under atmospheres and effects, once I expand my drop down, I'm going to click add, and there's a couple of things that I can do. I can add a volume light or a lens effect. A volume light, if we think about a nice foggy night with a light over a street or a street lamp, and that fog kind of defines how we can see our light. Well, a volume light does kind of the same thing in a sense. So that's what I want to do. I want to create kind of an effect where I have that outline of this light. I'm going to choose volume light. And then again, because I want to show something else, I'm going to choose add again. This time I'm going to choose a lens effect. And there's several different things that we can do there, and we'll go over that in just a minute. First, I want to go into the volume light, go to our setup, and here we have our environment and effects panel that comes up. Coincidentally, if when you render and you don't want that black background, so if I render, I see that black background. If I don't want that black background, in the same panel, environments and effect, I can choose my background color, or I can use a material. Personally, I like to go with about 64 in my value. So I have a nice little gray. And now if I render, we'll see that I have gray for my background. Now what we'll also see by default, we've kind of spoiled some of the fun there, is my volume light. You already kind of see what it does. We have that kind of nice foggy thing, but we'll go in there and we'll change some of the parameters anyway so we can see how they work. Another thing that we can do under environments and effect, or environment and effects, is we can change our exposure control. By default, 3ds Max doesn't have any exposure control. So we're going to choose any one of these that we want. I would recommend the mental ray photographic exposure only being used with mental ray renderer and mental ray lights and materials. And for us, we can do automatic exposure control. And if we want to see what our scene looks like, we can do a render preview. And it will give us a quick little what our scene is going to look like. Any one of these. So logarithmic is pretty nice. Not for this one. So maybe we'll just stick with automatic. Okay. So we have our volume light under effects, atmosphere and effects. And what we'll see is the light that we had chosen to put it on. Spotlight is there. If we want to pick another light, we can, or remove a light. If we want to have multiple lights, we can do all those things. Under volume, we have fog color and attenuation color. Our fog color is what's being shown by default. If we want to use the attenuation color, we can with our use attenuation color checkbox. And exponential, it might be a little bit difficult to explain, but basically it affects the density and whatnot of our fog. So let's turn that on. If you want to read more about that, I would suggest to look at the 3ds materials online about that. The density, the higher the density, the more solid looking the light effect is going to be. So maybe I want that to be like 2.5. And the max light is the max light that we'll see. So maybe we'll have like, I don't know, 85. No, because it was 90 before, maybe 70. Okay. And then all of these things here, our filter, our shadows, we're going to go ahead and keep that at the same, at the default. Our attenuation, maybe we'll say that our light starts at 100% and it ends at maybe 50%. So the further away our light gets, the softer our light is going to look. Any noise if we want to turn on, or any of these things, and if you want to do that, I would play around with those. For what we're talking about here, I'm not really going to use those. And then we'll render again and see what it looks like. So again, we have a softer light than what we had before. And this is a neat little effect that we can use for all kinds of things. So now maybe we can turn our Omni light down if we want to and have this be more pronounced. But maybe we're starting to go for like a showroom type feel. If we wanted to, maybe we could animate the car spinning around or whatever. Now that's just what we're going to do there. Another light that I want to look at is called, let's go to our Create tab, is called a Skylight. A skylight is a special type of light. It doesn't act like many of the other lights in 3ds Max. Much like an Omni light, a skylight sends light in all directions, but unlike an Omni light, a skylight doesn't have any point of origin, meaning that with an Omni light, we can tell where the light starts because once we get closer to the light is shining brighter in that area. But with a skylight, it's the same amount of light in all directions everywhere at the same time. And that might sound complicated, and if it does, that's okay. So let's turn, again, once we've created, we'll go to our Modify tab for our skylight. I'm going to turn my multiplier down to maybe something pretty soft, like 0.25. Okay. Then if our default renderer is, or if our renderer is the default scanline renderer, which is default by 3ds Max, we can use shadows here. And this won't cast shadows from this area because, again, it casts light everywhere at the same time. But what it will do, and what we can use it for, is to create kind of a fake or a facsimile of what's called ambient occlusion lighting. And that means that for every one of these objects, when a light ray hits it, it will bounce off of that plane and onto another plane and just keep going until eventually that light ray is absorbed. With Skylight, we can kind of fake where these two objects hit, and we have like the little shadow. We can kind of fake that, and it's called ambient occlusion. So we have that on there, and let's render it and see what it looks like. Another thing that you will notice is that it takes significantly longer to render if we have our Skylight on, especially if we're casting shadows. And I'll bring this over here so you can see how long it's taking to render. Significantly longer. The reason why this is because we're casting rays to figure out where our shadows are. And what we can see is we have some softer shadows in those corners here, softer shadows around the vehicle, and again, longer render times. Now let me zoom in so we can see that effect a little bit better. Now, let's render again. here we start rendering, and again, with our skylight, it takes quite a bit longer to render. There are some ways that we can cut that down, and we'll go over some of them. There's also some ways we can make it longer, and we can go over that too. We have a couple of lights in our scene. We also have an effect over our light, so we're having to calculate how that effect corresponds with everything else that's going in our scene. So our last frame took 36 seconds to render. Something tells me this one's going to be a little bit longer. But we can see that we're starting to get those nice soft shadows in our corners. That helps our scene look a little softer, not quite so artificial. We have some soft shadows around our vehicle. And we're about done. Okay, so here we have. One way that we can get our render to be a little quicker is if we turn those rays per sample down. So right now I have it on 20 samples, or 20 rays per sample. If I take that to maybe 4, which is a fifth, we can see how much faster it renders. But there is a trade-off, and we will see that. So let's render. We can see that it's significantly faster, but what we also see is it's quite grainy, kind of sandy. And these areas are the areas that the skylight is affecting. And since we were sending far fewer rays per sample out, our shadows aren't quite as soft. So we have a trade-off there. It can be faster, but the quality is also not there. Also, if we wanted these shadows to look even better, we can turn our rays per sample up higher. But again, if we do that, we'll have significantly longer render times. So we've looked at some lighting. We've looked at some different ways that we can cast shadows in our special parameters, such as the projector map. One thing that we haven't gone over yet, and I would like to, is we have that lens effect. Let's click on that lens effect and go to Setup. And again, we'll go to the Environment and Effects. But instead of being in the Environment tab, which we were before, now we're in the Effects tab. And here we see our lens effect. If we go a little bit further down to the lens effect parameters, we can choose several different types, glow, ring, so on and so forth. I'm going to choose glow because what I'm trying to do is I have this light up here that's shining down on my car, but if I render it, it doesn't look like there's any beginning to the light, or rather that there's a light glowing itself. It's just glowing straight down. So let's kind of see if we can have an effect so we can see where that light is. So I'm going to choose glow. And I'm going to go down to my glow effect. And if our lights, we can either pick a light again, or we already see, since I had that light selected, it's already there. And then my glow effect, the size, intensity, so on and so forth, color, if I want to use. Now the color, the radio color, what this means is that in the center of the light will be white. The further away, it will become more red. So for my size, I want to choose like 10, whatever. You can choose whatever you want. And understand that this is what's called a post-processing effect, which means that our renderer is going to render everything in the scene, and then this effect will be applied over it. So for this, so my render is not quite as long, I'll go ahead and get rid of my skylight. My radio color, I'll keep that white, but maybe from red, I'll change it to a green so we can kind of see. We'll know what to look for specifically. The intensity, maybe I want that to be a lot softer, maybe a 50. Source color would be, I believe, the color from the light itself. And so let's render this and see what we have going on. Okay, so what we saw, and this might be a little bit too soft to see, but what we saw is it rendered, and then we had an instant, and then right after that, we had our glow effect applied. So maybe we'll change this intensity back up to 100 so we can see what it's looking like and render again. So we render, Our render is done, and then we apply our light. And it might be difficult to see, but we can see just on the outer part of our light, we're starting to see that green from our radial color. We can change the fall off curve, but I'll let you do that on your own. Okay, so we've talked about some lights. Now let's talk about some cameras. Again, if I want to create something, I'll go to my Create tab, and instead of lights, I'll choose cameras. By default, 3ds Max has standard in our dropdown because that's the only one there is. We have 3 camera types: physical, target, and free. We're going to look at target and free because a physical camera works a lot like target camera. So first I'll click target, and if we can remember how our target light was and infer how it's going to work, we can click and hold, and we'll see that our camera is created as well as our target. And just with our target light, our camera is going to always be looking at its target. And if we move the target, it will always be moving, and the camera will always be looking at it. So let's set up something just to kind of get something to play around with. Okay. From here, we've created our camera. We've kind of set it up looking at what we want. Now we can go into the Modify tab, and we have a lot of different parameters here. Under parameters, we have the lens. This is the size of the lens, and the FOV, or the field of view. We can change both of these things, but as we are right now, we can't really see that. We can't really see what's going on. We need to change to our camera view. We can either come up here to perspective, right click, go to cameras and choose camera. A faster way is just to hit C on your keyboard. And here we are looking in our camera view. Now, if you have more than one camera in your scene and you hit C, it will ask you which camera you want to look at. This is an instance where we are in one pane. We can see through one pane, and that's great for most of what we do. But we want to be able to adjust our camera and see our camera at the same time. So from here, I'm going to go down to the very bottom right-hand part of my screen to maximize viewport toggle because I want to unmaximize it. We were maximized before. Now we want to be in something here. And you can change this to be as many panes as you want to. If you want to have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, that's fine. Typically, we would have 2 panes, one for our camera and one for another view. We're going to go ahead and stick with 4 just so we aren't trying to adjust things during the tutorial. And so let's choose from left, we're going to choose perspective. And then I'm going to go ahead and turn my wireframe off and turn off so I don't see the wires. And now I can see everything in my scene and my camera. If I take a look at my camera, select it and move it, I can see in my camera pane exactly what my camera is seeing. So this is a really good idea. I highly suggest doing this. I'm not sure what's going on with why I'm wigging out there. I would highly suggest having so that you can see everything that's going on. And I'm going to turn on wireframe just a minute so I can grab that target. If I move the target up, we see how it's adjusting it in our camera scene or our camera pane. We still have all the tools available. So if I click on my camera, I still have all the parameters and whatnot that I want to change. I can change from orthographic. If I change to orthographic, then I have a different view. I'm in the same as an orthographic view. I'm going to turn that off because I don't care. I like this better. Now the stock lenses here, we can choose 15 millimeter all the way down to 200, and this mimics, like if we have a 35 millimeter camera, we click on 35, it will mimic a 35 millimeter camera, which means our lens size and our field of view will also change to correspond. See, a lot of these for the length of the video, we'll just say you can play around with these if you want to. What I do want to go over though is the clipping plane and multipass effects. The clipping plane, clipping means basically that you would see through an object. So if you've ever played a video game and the camera clips through the character's head and you can kind of see the back of their eyeballs and it looks kind of weird, we can adjust the clipping plane of our camera. And then we have our multipass effect, which we're going to talk about but won't do because it takes quite a few times to render for these things to happen. But we can enable them, and then we have the depth of field, and we have motion blur. We also have depth of field, mental ray, but since we're not using mental ray, we won't go over that. So depth of field, what it is it's going to focus on a specific length. Anything past that length, the further away it will start to get more blurry, and anything closer than that length will also look blurry. And then we have the motion blur. The faster an object goes, the more blurry it will look in the direction of the motion. The same with the camera. If you're moving the camera really quick, it will do the same thing. And then there we have motion blur parameters, where we can tell it how many passes, how many samples do we want to take to get that blur effect. The lower amount of passes will take less, but the quality will also be lower. And inversely, as we can infer, the more or the higher number of passes, the better it will look, but the longer it will take to do it. So here, we've taken a look at lights, parameters for the lights, shadows, cameras, and parameters of the cameras. And remember, if there's anything that we can change, any number that we can change, then it can be animated. So we can get some really cool looking effects. So maybe we want like a flickering light or something like that. Well, we can change those with, let's maybe take a look at that. We'll take a couple of seconds to take a look at that. And I want to go back in my scene here. And maybe with my Omni light, I want to have like a flicker effect. Because we were having so many problems, I went ahead and restarted Max, and we seem to be working now. So we had talked about lights and cameras, and one thing that I wanted to show was how we can animate some of these properties. You would think that if I wanted the light to flicker, as we talked about before, maybe I could just turn my light on and off. That doesn't quite work so well. But if I come down and turn my auto key on, because I really don't want to think too much about what I'm animating, just want to move and let it adjust something and it does it for me. If I change this multiplier, like maybe my first frame I'll be at 0.5, 0.5, and anytime we see red around a property, that means that we have either animated it or we're currently animating it. So if I go to maybe the next frame after that and turn that down to 0, and come to the next frame and maybe turn that back up to 5. And if I scrub through, now we've got our adaptive degradation on there, so it's going to take a little bit, but I want you to play around with this. So we have our light off, we have our light back on. So what we can do is we can have kind of like a flicker effect going on, and when we render it, it will look like that light's flickering. That's a pretty neat little effect. So what we've gone over today is lighting, how to create lights, how to modify the parameters of the lights, how we can create some neat effects for the lights, how to create cameras, adjust the parameters of the camera, move a camera, and whatnot. So that's all that we're going to go over today. I think that we did forget to create a free camera. So let's create a free camera real quick. The difference between a target camera and a free camera is that a free camera has no specific target it's looking at. Instead, we just rotate, move the camera wherever we want it pointing to. It's a little bit different. Not too much there. We've pretty much gone over that. So take some time, play around with these settings. You're not going to break it. The worst thing that happens is maybe you have to restart your 3ds Max application. Maybe you have to Control Z to undo what you did, but nothing's going to blow up. At least nothing that we know of anyway. That's about it.